Today we're looking at Joshua, and we'll start today with Joshua and finish on Wednesday, and then maybe also be able to start the next book, Judges, on Wednesday. We'll see. But we're starting Joshua today, and Joshua is the first book that we've had that's not in the Torah. It's not the Pentateuch, those first 5 books. And so every other book we've looked to at this point, up to this point, has had the same authorship and dating information. So it's been around 1400s BC, and the author, at least the bulk of the material, was written by Moses, and then updated at some point later, at very least, to add the death of Moses to the end of Deuteronomy, but probably to make a few edits other places as well. But the primary author was Moses. Well, we're going to have a very similar explanation for the book of Joshua. It's just not going to be Moses, and it's going to be a little bit later date. And so Joshua is probably from about 100 years later than most of the Torah, the books of Moses. And Joshua is the traditionally understood author, and there's several things in the book that kind of strengthen that understanding. That Joshua is the author. There's several points in the narrative where first person is used, and so it's I or we, and so the author was somebody that was present for the events of the book, and so Joshua makes sense. It claims to be by Joshua. It's an eyewitness, or it claims to be an eyewitness testimony. But then there's also some things that are obviously added later. Like with Deuteronomy, there is the death of Joshua at the very end, and you can't write about your own death. So there's, just like with the books of Moses, Joshua is the presumed primary author, the one that wrote most of the material as we experienced it, as an eyewitness. And then later, some material was edited in. And there's even a potential name for, some people think that a couple of people that are named in the book may have been the ones that added the material later, either Phineas or Eleazar the priest. But that's uncertain, unknown. There's no claim to that. It's just makes some sense. But it's probably written by Joshua primarily, with some later editing, and is probably written in the latter half of the 1300s. BC. And so somewhere between 1300, 1350, somewhere in that later half, near the end of Joshua's life. And then edited a little bit later and comes down eventually to the final form that we have. The book of Joshua itself, as I hinted at last time, has some stories in it and depicts some things that are kind of troubling and worrying to a lot of people, Christians, non-Christians alike. Especially in the second major division. We'll get to the divisions, how the book is broken up in a minute. But in the second major division, there's a whole lot of battle, and God tells the Israelites to kill the occupants of entire towns, to wipe out entire cities. And that stuff is disturbing. The idea that God would command people to wipe out a whole town is, on one side, is disturbing, and then the fact that people have historically, there have been at least moments where people have used those commands in Joshua to justify wiping out other people, or justify going to war, to fighting in general, and justify a lot of killing based on these commands given in Joshua. And so all of that amounts up to some pretty disturbing possibilities. And we'll get to how to address some of that in a little bit. But at the end of the day, some of those things they're going to remain disturbing. And some of that is because of the world that we live in, our sensibilities. Our sensibilities are very different when it comes to violence and war. In a lot of ways for better, and probably in some ways for worse. But the book of Joshua is divided up into four big sections, and each of those sections is kind of dominated by a verb that's used frequently and describes the kind of main thing that's happening in the book at that point. And the first major section is the cross section. The verb cross shows up a lot in the section, and this is the section that deals with their crossing of the Jordan River and coming into the Promised Land. If you remember how Deuteronomy ended, the last book, Deuteronomy ended with the death of Moses after giving his long speech. And they were on the east bank of the Jordan River, or they were on the east side of the Jordan River, and receiving these commands and these final instructions from Moses before he died. And so they're not yet in the Promised Land. They have not yet crossed over into the land of Canaan. And so the first thing that's going to happen in the book of Joshua is several events surrounding the crossing into the Promised Land, crossing the Jordan River. And so the chapters 1 through 5, except for a little bit at the very end of chapter 5, are going to be dedicated to that crossing of the Jordan River. And then the second major section is dominated by the verb take, which is the section that is dealing with all of the battles and the conquest, all the fighting that happens, and the Israelites conquering various cities and all of that stuff. They're taking these cities, they're taking this land. And so it's dominated by this verb take, and that's where all the fighting happens. And then the biggest section of the book, actually, starting in chapter 13, and I think it's 13, chapter 13 through 21, is dominated by the word divide, and this is the division of the land, how the land is supposed to be parceled out between the various tribes and the various clans within the tribes, and then certain other kind of qualifications and specifications for things about the division of the land. And this section is, honestly, to us, is pretty dry and not that interesting. I mean, it's like looking at it's like being shown a map, but there's no pictures. It's all descriptions of where the boundaries should be instead of having actual a picture and being able to see where the boundaries should be. And so it's a long section dealing with the division of the land and describes where the various territory boundaries are supposed to be for all the different tribes. And for us, this is not that exciting, but it was very necessary for the Israelites because God had commanded that the divisions of the land were supposed to be permanent. Land was supposed to be passed down family to family, generation to generation, and not permanently sold or transferred amongst them. And so you could buy land, but it was really you were buying the right to use the land to raise crops on until a specified time. And so you couldn't actually permanently transfer ownership of the land the way that we think of it. You were actually buying the right to produce crops on the land for so long. But the land itself was always supposed to revert back, the ownership was supposed to revert back to the families that were described in Joshua, the lands, the boundaries as they were described there. So this is not all that interesting to us, but it was very vital for them to have this permanent record in this authoritative source for where the boundaries of the lands were. And then the final section is dominated with the word serve, and that's because, like at the end of Deuteronomy, this is the section where Joshua addresses the people before his death and calls on them to remain faithful to God, to keep the covenant, and to serve him. And so he, like Moses does at the end of Deuteronomy, presents to the people of Israel this kind of stark choice between serving God or doing something else. Serving the gods of the Canaanites, or whatever. But to choose and to stick with their choice, to make their choice and stick with it, whether to serve God or not. And that's that last section. And from this description, you might, and as we go, you'll pick up on, there's several things that are very parallel between the story that we've seen in the last several books with Moses and Joshua's stories. There's all these kind of echoes and repetitions. And so, for example, after Joshua addresses the people and they're encouraged to cross over and to be courageous and to go into the land, to cross over the Jordan River, Joshua sends out spies to check out the land, especially Jericho. And if you remember back in Numbers, God tells Moses to send out spies to go check out the Promised Land, and they come back and report. And then at the very end of this first section, or the very beginning of the second section, actually, Joshua is going to have this encounter where he's told that he is standing on holy ground. He has this encounter with God, and he's told to remove his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. Just like Moses was told to remove his shoes when he was in front of the burning bush because he was on holy ground. And then when they do cross the Jordan River, they do it on dry ground, just like Moses led the people across the Red Sea, or through the Red Sea on dry ground. And so the Jordan River is going to be stopped, and they're going to cross on dry ground. And then the very end of the book, as I just said, there's going to be this long speech by Joshua where he reminds them of all that God has done and gives them this stark choice between serving God and not serving God, just like Moses does at the end of Deuteronomy, where he says, today I set before you blessings and curses, life and death, and choose life so that you and your descendants may live. And so there's all of this parallel between Moses' life and career and Joshua's life and career, and that's intentional. We're intentionally being shown these parallels between Moses and Joshua so that we'll be reminded and we'll remember that Joshua is Moses' successor, and he has received some kind of portion, or he has received approval from God to lead the people of Israel as Moses did. And so that those parallels are intentional. We're supposed to see those. It's supposed to be able to connect Joshua's leadership as a continuation of Moses' leadership, the one that led them out of Israel or led them out of Egypt and gave them the laws and the tabernacle, all that. That all of that is we're still continuing that tradition. So these are the four major divisions. So we'll start looking first at the first one, the cross section. Beginning of Joshua, we have a kind of a brief recap of Moses' death and Joshua taking over leadership. And then God speaks to Joshua and encourages him and tells him to be strong, to be courageous, to keep the law and to do as God commands. And if he will keep this law and meditate on it day and night, he will do the things that God tells him to do, then God will be with him always. God will remain with him. And this actually is, if you remember when we were talking about the book of Leviticus, you remember that literary structure, rhetorical structure I told you about, where you have a sequence of things, and then that whole sequence is repeated on the other side in reverse order. It was a chiasmus, and you get a thing at the beginning and the end that are very similar, and then the things inside of that are very similar. This section at the beginning of chapter 1 of Joshua is a chiastic structure. You can see it saying in verse 5, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead this people to inherit the land. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. That whole section is chiastic. You see, the very last thing that was said there, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go, is mirrored at the very beginning in verse 5. As I was with Moses, so I'll be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. So the concept there at the beginning and the end is God will always be with him. God will never leave him or forsake him. And then just before or after that first idea and just before that last idea is then you will be prosperous and successful, and you will inherit the land at the beginning. You will inherit the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. And then inside of that is be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be careful to verse 7 starts with be strong and courageous, and then verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. And then be careful to obey all of the law that you've been given, and to do, don't turn from it to the right to the left. And if you look at that, the chiastic, there's this chiastic structure, and the thing in the middle, the most important bit, the thing that you're supposed to draw your attention to is keep this book of the law with you always, and obey what's in it. And so the be strong and courageous, all this prosperity, all of that promise, everything, it all centers around and flows out of that obey what you're told, keep the commandments, keep the book of the law on you. So God gives Joshua this encouragement, tells him to be strong and courageous, and to go and keep these commands. And so then Joshua turns and begins to organize the people and to encourage them to get ready to cross over the Jordan River. And as he is working on getting this massive encampment of over 1 million people organized to start crossing over the river, he chooses 2 men to go and spy out the land, and tells them especially to check out Jericho. Now, Jericho, you can't really see much on this map because it's small and you're far away. But if you see here, there's this blue streak. That's the Sea of Galilee at the top, and the Dead Sea at the bottom, and the River Jordan connecting them. So you get that this strip of water here. And they are, the Jordan River is that strip of blue, and they're on your right side of it, on the east side of it. And Jericho, I can't get more than my fingernail in between the dot for Jericho and the Jordan River. And so Jericho is really close to, it's several miles away from the Jordan River, but it's fairly close to the Jordan River. And so it's going to be the first thing that they come to when they cross into the land. Once they cross over, the first thing they're going to have to deal with is this very well fortified city of Jericho. And so Joshua sends these spies in and tells them to be careful to observe Jericho. And they're checking out everything else, make sure that they really pay attention to Jericho. And so they go and they do their thing, they're checking out the land around, and they go into Jericho, and they're there to spy out the city while they're there. And they go into this woman's house named Rahab. And Rahab is a prostitute. And so Rahab, she has a house that is, her home is built right up against the inside of the city wall. And so one of the walls of her home is actually the city wall, the thing that's supposed to hold out defenders, or hold out attackers and defend the city. And we're told that there is this window up near the top. Her home is a few stories tall, and up near the top there is a window, and that window is actually through the city wall and goes outside, but it's way up off the ground. It's still defensible. And so she has this window that lets out to the outside of the city. And so these men come in and they stay with her. They spend the nights there and they're checking out the city. And at some point along the way, the city officials, city leaders figure out that these men have been staying in Rahab's home. And apparently they have enough warning, because Rahab takes these men and puts them on the roof of her house. And the roof of houses in the Middle East at this point were mostly flat top roofs. And they might have like a kind of a low wall around the edge of the roof, and you would use the roof for just kind of various utilitarian purposes. Things like if you had stuff that you needed to dry out, you'd put on the top on the roof, and the sun and wind would dry it out on the roof. And in this case, Rahab has these bundles of plants, of rushes, that are used for making roofs and making brooms and making all kinds of various things. These plants can be used several different ways, but they're up there on the roof, and they're spread out to dry out. And she sends these two men up there to bury themselves in underneath the rushes and hide. And when the soldiers of Jericho, when these fighting men from Jericho come and start pounding on the door and saying, "Bring out these men that have been staying with you," she hides them. And so she goes out to these men from the city. And she says, "Look, they were staying here, yes, but at just before sunset, before the gates of the city closed, they left, and I don't know which way they went. So if you hurry up now and go after them, you might still be able to catch up with them." And they believe her, and they take off, and they go out of the city and start trying to chase these spies down, whichever way they went. And she goes up and speaks to the two men, and she says, basically, "I know why you're here. And I know that your God, that the Lord has given this land to you and your people. We've heard about what you and your people have done on the other side of the Jordan River, and how God gave you victory against those nations on the other side. And so we know that you're coming here, and the whole city is terrified of what's going to happen. And so here's what I want from you. I have protected you tonight, protected you here, and here's what I want from you. When your people come, and when the city falls, promise me that me and my family will be spared, that we'll be allowed to live." And the spies agree and say that as long as she doesn't betray them and tell them what they were doing here, then they will make sure that she's taken care of. And so they agree. She is going to take a scarlet rope and tie it in this window that goes out to the outside of the city. And so they'll be able to see it from outside the city and know which house is hers. And so they tie this scarlet cord in the window, and they promise that any of her family and anything that is hers that is inside the city, inside that house, inside the home when they come to the city, will be spared. But to make sure that everybody is there. And then they leave and go back, and they give their report to Joshua and report about having made this promise. And Joshua agrees with them that they've made this promise, and so they will spare Rahab and her family. And then after this, that's all in chapter 2. And then chapter 3, Rahab's story is in chapter 2. Chapter 3, they start the process of crossing over the Jordan River with the whole camp. And God gives them instructions for how to do this. He tells them to put the priests in front with the Ark of the Covenant at the foremost place, and then everybody else is to follow about 200 yards behind. And so the priests with the Ark of the Covenant are to go first, and then as they step down into the river, God will stop the flow of the Jordan River and cause the waters to pile up upstream. And sure enough, when they start to walk into the Jordan River, the priests walk down into the Jordan River, and the water very quickly stops flowing, and the ground dries out for them to cross. And God tells them to take the Ark of the Covenant, the priests to go and stand in the middle of the river and just wait there until the whole camp of Israel has passed by and gotten through. And so the whole camp starts to pass by and to go through the Jordan River. And God also tells Joshua to have one man from each of the 12 tribes to pick up a stone as big as he can carry and carry it out of the middle of the river. So to take stones from the riverbed, where they would normally not be able to get to, take stones from the riverbed and carry them across up on the other side, and then build a monument to remember this moment by. So they do. One man from each of the 12 tribes bends down as they're crossing and picks up a large stone, as big as he can carry, and carries it on across. And they take those stones and make a piled up monument with those 12 stones to remind themselves and the future generations what God did in allowing them to cross the Jordan River. And then as soon as everybody's across, the priests, they're holding the Ark of the Covenant, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, walk up out of the river, and the river starts flowing. And we're told specifically, actually, that the water was piling up upstream at another town upstream, and the people in that town are watching this water pile up and are kind of terrified. They don't know what in the world is going on. And so after all of the camp of Israel passes through and gets to the other side, the priests come up out of the water, or out of the riverbed, and God allows the water to start flowing again. And so they have crossed over on dry ground, and now they are in the promised land. They have come into the land. And once they get into the land, there's a couple of things that they have to do that one, it's almost time for Passover, and so they're going to celebrate the Passover. But before that, they have not been circumcising since they have been wandering, the 40 years that they spent wandering in the wilderness. They haven't circumcised anybody.
All the military-aged men in the group, did they?
They circumcised all the boys and men in the group, military men and whatever. Every male in the camp, 8 days old and older, is circumcised. And so they circumcise everybody, and we learned in a previous story and back in Genesis that it takes several days afterwards to recover. In that case, they circumcised, all the men in the city were circumcised, and the sons of Jacob used their weakness afterwards as an opportunity to go kill everybody after they had raped their sister. So, justified, not justified, it's iffy. But in this case, they circumcise everybody and they spend the days of recovery, and then at the end of the period of recovery, it's about time for the Passover. And so they celebrate the Passover for the first time in the Promised Land. And they do all of the Passover celebration, the Feast of Unleavened Bread afterwards, and after they have eaten the Passover, all of a sudden, the next morning they get up and there's no manna. For over 40 years, God has provided food for them through the wilderness by giving manna every morning. But now they have crossed over into the Promised Land, and they have celebrated the Passover, and they have begun to eat of the fruit of the land. The text says they've begun to eat the fruit of the land. They're actually able to eat the fruit of the Promised Land. And when they get to eat the fruit of the Promised Land, the manna stops. And everybody's happy about it. And you'd think, at 40 years free food, and all of a sudden the buffet's dried up, they might be a little worried, but they are all joyful and encouraged, and they're all celebrating it because God has now, for 40 years, he's been providing through manna in the wilderness, and now God is providing through the fruits of the land that he had promised them. And so this is their kind of one more sign or one more signal that they are home. They are in the Promised Land. God has begun to fulfill his promise to them. And then, so that brings us to the beginning of chapter 5, through the midpoint and towards the end of chapter 5, actually. And then the very last part of chapter 5, they are now crossed over in the Promised Land. They've celebrated the Passover for the first time. They've begun to eat the fruit of the land, and so the manna has stopped. And now Joshua turns his attention to Jericho, the city that's not far away. And so he gets up and he begins to go and walk towards Jericho to check out and see it with his own eyes. And as he's walking and headed towards Jericho, all of a sudden he sees this man standing there, and this man is standing there with a bared sword. He has his sword out in his hand. And so Joshua, this scene is important, so make sure that you're catching this. Joshua shouts out to him and says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the man replies back and says, "Neither, but as the commander of the armies of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua, when he hears this reply, and he realizes, this is not just a guy, this is God's presence somehow. This is the commander of the armies of the Lord, as he's introduced himself. This is the angel of the Lord that has shown himself to Moses and others in the past. He falls down on his face and bows down in front of this figure and says, "What commands does the Lord have for me or for us?" And this figure replies, the commander of the army of the Lord, commander of the armies of the Lord replies and says, "Take off your shoes. The ground you're standing on is holy ground." And that's it. That's the command. Now, it's a little tiny scene. It's only a few verses long, and it's kind of weird, but it's important for a couple of reasons. One is, Joshua is seeing the presence of God, and he's going to be given his instructions for how to go about fighting against Jericho. And we'll get to that in a minute. But also, this response, this very first interaction, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither, but as commander of the armies of the Lord I have come." That interaction gives us a kind of a point to understand some of what's happening in this book, especially some of the things that are kind of disturbing to us. So there's three things that I want you to catch, and at least one of them hinges, at least partially, on this verse. What Joshua says indicates that he's thinking of the situation as being the people of Israel against the people of Canaan, and God is going to support them in conquering Canaan. God's going to give them the land, but the battle or the issue or the lines are divided between Israel and Canaanites, the Israelites and the Canaanites. And so he says, "Are you for us, the Israelites, or for our enemies, the Canaanites?" And this reply, the commander of the armies of the Lord's reply, is "Neither, but as commander of the armies of the Lord I have now come." So basically, I'm on neither side. I'm here for my own reasons. And Joshua immediately falls down to worship him. And so that interaction shows that Joshua is thinking of things as being Israel versus the Canaanites. And if you think of it that way, and then you see God commanding the wholesale slaughter of people in the cities and giving them the land, this looks like God is just being totally partisan. He's picking the Israelites over everybody else, and he's willing to wipe out everybody else to give them the land. And so it looks like the Israelites are coming in, and because they're God's special people, they get special treatment, and everybody else can just die. But the commander of the army of the Lord replies and says, "Neither, I'm here for my own reasons." And then it's, are you going with me? So Joshua thinks of it as being us and them, and God says, "No, there's another side. I'm here for my own purposes, and you can come with me," basically. And so with that in mind, that God is here for his own purposes. God is doing something in Canaan that doesn't have everything to do with Israel. It's not just God is there to help the Israelites. God has his own purposes in Canaan. And part of the purpose that God has, that we've seen in several places mentioned before, is the Canaanites are corrupt. The various tribes in Canaan are doing some really messed up stuff. And in fact, all the way back, if you look all the way back to the story of Abraham, when God first makes the covenant with Abraham to give him and his family the land, and in Genesis 15, God tells Abraham what's going to happen, that his family will spend 400 years in slavery in Egypt, and then afterwards be brought out of the land, and God will bring them to the promised land. But he tells them in that same passage that God isn't giving Abraham the land yet because the sin of the people in the land has not yet reached its full measure. And so there's this, God is saying basically the people in this land have not yet reached the capacity for sin that they're going to have in the future. And so that God is aware that this corruption in the land is growing. And then later God tells the people tells the Israelites that he is going up to fight against them, and he's going to use the Israelites to bring judgment on them. And then there are certain commandments that God gives along the way that are specifically because, or mentioned at least as being specifically in opposition to the practices of the people in the land. And so one of the things that we know is going on in Canaan at this point is, as I mentioned in the last lecture, infant sacrifice. People are killing their infant children as part of the worship rites for some of these gods and goddesses that are being worshipped in the land. And so they have a problem with idolatry, but almost everybody in the world is doing idolatry at this point. But the Canaanites specifically have some gods that are being worshipped that they're worshiping them with infant sacrifice, and that's detestable to God. And then also we know of some really kind of out there sexual perversion stuff that's going on. And if you look in Leviticus chapter 18, there's some specific instructions and things that God has to tell the Israelites that seem kind of obvious, but because of where they're going to be living, God has to specifically tell them not to, for example, sleep with their parents and their siblings and their children, or their children's spouses, or the animals in their fields. I mean, all of these things God specifically tells them not to do because the Canaanites are doing them. And they have to know that that's not okay before they go into the land. And so for all of that, I mean, for those two reasons, the infant sacrifice and the weird sexual perversions going on, those two at least were explicitly told, but then there's other stuff that's going on that we're not explicitly told about. All of that adds up to a very corrupt, very messed up society that God is judging and dealing with. And God just so happens to be using the Israelites to do it and is going to give them the land as well. And so God is judging and dealing with the sin of the Canaanites by sending in or by bringing in the Israelites. And so the Israelites are being used as God's tool for judgment. Another thing to note, so that's one thing. The Canaanites are not innocent. It's not that they're just there and these mean Israelites are coming in and wiping them out because God told them to. It's the Canaanites have done some pretty terrible things, and God is judging them, and the land is kind of a side effect, keeping that other promises. The promise that God made to their ancestors is also part of it. So that's one. The second thing is you got to understand that there is quite a bit of hyperbolic language used in Joshua. And if you're not familiar with hyperbolic outside of geometry, which is a totally different thing, hyperbole is the root here, and hyperbole is to overstate something in order to make a rhetorical point. So if I were to tell you that I'm not feeling well, I think I'm so sick I feel like I'm going to die. At no point in my life has that actually been true. I had swine flu in 2009, and there was a point along the way where I thought, I could see how if I was already unhealthy, this could kill me. But that's the closest I've ever come to actually feeling like I was about to die because I was sick. But I've used that phrase. It's never actually literally been true, but to anybody that hears me say it, it expresses that I feel really bad, right? And so we use hyperbole on a regular basis to express ourselves, and a ton of our absolute language, when I say all or always or never, almost all of that ends up being hyperbole. And we know that that hyperbole happens frequently in the scripture and is kind of an accepted form. Even Jesus uses hyperbole in the New Testament. So there's this hyperbole is kind of an accepted form, and it was expected in these kind of ancient battle records, the records of battle. The victorious side would almost always use a kind of hyperbolic language to describe their victory, and part of that would be that they would describe as wiping out everybody or killing everything in the town, and that didn't actually end up happening. And we know that didn't actually happen in every case in Joshua, because some of the cities that are specifically said as being everyone in the town was put to the sword, later we find that there are Canaanites, just a little while later, we find that there are Canaanites living in the cities, those same towns that the Israelites have to deal with. And so obviously not everyone in the city was killed. That was just a convention of some of these ancient battle reports, and the author, Joshua, is following that convention. And it was understood by most of the people that would have been reading it at the time. And so a lot of the language is hyperbolic. A lot of the time when it's commanded that everyone in the city be killed, or that Joshua reports that everyone in the city is killed, that's not actually what happens. And that was kind of an accepted form at the time. And then the last thing to understand as we're going through these really kind of extreme and difficult commands that we see is that God gives these commands to Israel, and the people carry them out with varying degrees of rigor. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But God gives these commands, but they're not intended for anybody else in any other situation to repeat, ever. There's sometimes that God tells somebody to do something in the scripture, and it's not just for them. Everybody's supposed to imitate that example. Or somebody does something that's good, and we're all supposed to imitate that example. Jesus in the New Testament gives the parable of the Good Samaritan, tells the story of this man that is robbed going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and this Samaritan man takes the time to stop and bind up his wounds and carry him and pay for him to be taken care of even after he has to leave. And at the end of that story, Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." And so it's clear that that's an example we're supposed to follow. At no point are we ever told to imitate the example of these battles, what God told the Israelites to do. And there have been times that people have used these stories and the commands that God gives in Joshua to justify doing things, but that was never their intended use. And that's always people misusing these texts. This was God doing something at a particular moment in history, fulfilling promises that he had made to their ancestors. And so we're supposed to see in this God's justice, that he hates sin and he deals with the Canaanites and their sinful society, and God's faithfulness, that in taking care of the Canaanites, he also fulfills his promise to the Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their descendants, all the Israelites. And so God is just in dealing with the sin of the Canaanites, and God is faithful in keeping his promise to the Israelites. And this is how he does it. It's not supposed to be any kind of example for people to follow later, or any kind of justification for going to war or killing anybody. Right? So, that's still all of that understanding that it's in reaction to the sin of the Canaanites. It's not as absolute as it sounds, and people aren't totally wiped out the way that it sounds. It's hyperbolic, and it's not intended to be repeated. That makes it easier to understand, or easier to accept some of the things that are said in the book and the commands that are given, but it's still not totally easy. There's still things in this book that disturb us, even with all that understanding. But God gives the commands. He tells Joshua to take off his shoes on holy ground, and then they go and they're looking at Jericho, and God gives Joshua the battle plan for this first great battle, the first fight as they cross into the Promised Land. And a lot of you have probably heard this story before, and so you know what the battle plan is. But just for the sake of emphasis or rhetorical force, pretend like this is the first time you have ever heard it. Try to imagine what it would be like hearing this battle plan as an adult for the first time, and thinking about how effective this is likely to be. Right? So here they are. They're at the edge of the Promised Land, or they're in the Promised Land, coming up on this first city that they've got to attack. And God tells them specifically what they have to do to win the battle, how the fight should go. And so God tells them to take all of the fighting men from the camp, to lead out all of those the military men, all the ones that can fight, and put them in a column. And then at the very front of that column, in front of all the fighting men, they're to put the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And then in front of that, they're supposed to put 7 of the priests with trumpets to blow, put the musicians. And so the very frontline fighters in this fight are the musicians. If it was a matter of life and death, how many of y'all are putting Renaissance in front?
Someone Renaissance, not me.
Yeah. If I got to pick a group on campus to put at the very front of the battle, I'll probably go in with like football players, right? They at least are going to be beefy. Renaissance is not, the musicians are not the ones that I think of as most physically capable. Can I put it that way? It's not that they're not, but that's not what they're known for. Putting the musicians in the very front of your battle plan is a little strategically questionable, right? And then God tells Joshua that the plan is each day for the first 6 days, the army in this configuration, with the priests in front carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and the musicians with seven musicians with 7 trumpets up in front of even the Ark of the Covenant, are to march around the city in total silence, no blowing of the horns, nobody in the army even speaking to each other. Total silence, march around the city one time, and then go back to camp. Day 1, they walk around the city, total silence, trumpets in front, Ark behind that, all the military men behind that, and then they come back to camp. Day 2, same thing, another lap. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, first 6 days, 1 lap around the camp, and then come back. And then finally on the 7th day, they're to march around the city 7 times, and on the 7th time, they're to blow the trumpets, and everybody is supposed to yell really loud, and they'll win. And that's the battle plan God gives them for the first major battle in the Promised Land. Anybody just see the incredibly powerful strategy in this, that this is really going to get them. This is military genius. No, from a military standpoint, this is ludicrous. This is ridiculous. It's like we're going to walk around the city 6 days, once a day, and that's it. That's the whole preparation, and we're not going to say anything or do anything. Have any of you ever seen VeggieTales? Yeah, there's a specific scene of VeggieTales that has this kind of Battle of Jericho as the theme, and all the characters in VeggieTales are vegetables, right? And so for Jericho, they have the defenders on the wall are these English peas with French accents, and I don't know why they're English peas with French accents, but they're English peas with French accents. And there's this whole scene where they look out and they just ridicule the people of Israel as they walk around the circle. And there's this whole song about how stupid it is and that our walls will not be falling down. So they just walk around the city. And I got to think the only thing that's happening in the first 6 days is the people of Jericho are looking out and saying, this is what we were afraid of? Really? It's like, this is stupid. And then day 7, they do their 7 trips around and they blow the trumpet, and the people, all the fighting men start yelling really loud, and the walls fall down. So the walls collapse, and then Joshua says, well, the walls are down, get in there. And tells the fighting men to go and start fighting. Well, they go and they start charging in and they fight. And I mean, the people of Jericho, most of the fighting men are probably going to be up on the walls. And even the ones that are down in the city have just watched the full circumference of the walls of their city just collapse. They're not in much situation to fight. They're stunned by the event. And so the Israelites just charge on in and have basically no opposition. And not a man dies on Israel's side that day. They fight and they win without a loss that day. And the only exception to the total destruction of the city is Rahab's house. And Rahab and her family are brought out and put in a camp out. They're put in a place, a tent, outside of the rest of the camp of Israel because they're not Israelites, and the camp itself is holy. But they're put there, and they're able, over the next few generations, they get taken in. They become Israelite, basically. They're taken in. And in fact, you'll find Rahab the prostitute, her name comes up in Jesus' family tree when you get to the New Testament and you read the Gospels. Rahab is one of Jesus' ancestors. And so the city collapses and they go in and start killing. And Jericho is one of the cities that everything is dedicated to destruction. Everything is supposed to be destroyed. And so all of the people are supposed to be killed, all the animals are killed, and all of the stuff is supposed to be just destroyed and left. None of the Israelites are supposed to take anything. The only thing that's supposed to come out of the city is the gold and silver, some gold and silver articles that are supposed to be taken and put in the treasury of the tabernacle to be used later. And so they go in, they attack, they fight, they kill everything, they take all of the gold and silver out as they're supposed to, and they set the rest of the city on fire. They burn everything. Except for this one guy, Achan, and we'll come back to him in just a second. Well, they've just had this rousing victory, this incredible thing, march around the city 7 times and make a lot of noise and the walls fall, like this ludicrous battle plan that gives the victory. And so they're feeling great, and Joshua goes ahead and sends a group to spy out the next city, which is called Ai or Ai. And so he sends this group ahead to scout out the next city, and they look at it to see what the defenses are like. They come back and they tell Joshua it's a relatively small city. They don't have that much of a military. If we win this with what we had here, you only need to send 2,000 or 3,000 to go to Ai. And so Joshua sends a group of 3,000 to Ai, and they attack it. And they get their hind parts handed to them, and they are beaten into a retreat. And several dozen Israelites die in this battle for this much smaller city. Now, 2 things happened here. One, in my description of the events, the way that this went, Joshua sent the spies ahead after the Battle of Jericho. They found that it was a small, much more lightly defended city, and they recommended that he only needed 2,000 to 3,000 men instead of taking the whole army and wearying the whole army. And Joshua took the advice and went and attacked, and they got beaten. What in that sequence of events did you not hear?
You didn't ask God or pray to God about what happened?
At no point did they ask God anything about this. They were high off of that first victory, and so they went off and charged off and did it their own way. And they lost. Well, Joshua then goes and he's bowing in front of the ark along with many of the elders and crying out to God, why did this happen? How did we lose this battle? Why did you forsake us and abandon us here? Why did you bring us here just to die? All these things. And God speaks to Joshua and says, get up and stop your wailing. You lost the battle because there's sin in the camp, because you have done what shouldn't be done. And some of the things that were supposed to be dedicated for destruction have been kept. And so consecrate yourselves, consecrate all of the camp, and then tomorrow morning have everyone assemble, and I will show you who is responsible. And so the next morning they get up and everybody is arranged out and assembles and arranges out by tribe. And so they're all broken up into those tribes, the 12 tribes. And God shows Joshua that it's the tribe of Judah. And so the tribe of Judah steps forward and breaks out by clans, which are the kind of big group family divisions within the tribe. And so God shows Joshua that it's this particular clan within the tribe of Judah. And that clan steps forward, and then they break out by their big family groups. And so all these interrelated families step forward and they break out. And God shows Joshua that it's this particular family. And that family steps forward and it breaks out into all the households. And God shows Joshua that it's this one particular man, Achan, or Achan. It'd be a closer Hebrew pronunciation. But Achan is the one that God selects out. And so Joshua goes to him and says, what did you do? It's time to come clean and give glory to God by telling the truth. What did you do? And Achan says that while they were plundering the city, or while they were attacking the city and going through it, he saw these sets of clothing that he thought looked really good, and so he kept them. And there was, this pile of silver coins that he found, and he wanted those, and so he stuck those in his pocket, and some gold and stuff too. He found this set of stuff, a few things that he attached to the city that he thought was really, really great, and wouldn't be ashamed if this was destroyed, and so he kept it. And he dug a hole underneath his tent and buried it there, and that's what happened. And so Joshua sends some men to go and check it out. They dig up the hole, dig up underneath his tent. They find the stuff that he said. And so God tells Joshua to take Achan and all of his belongings, his tent, everything that belongs to him, all of his animals, and the rest of his family, and put them in this depression in the ground. And then the whole nation of Israel surrounds them and takes stones and stones them to death. And then they pile up even more stones after everything is dead. They pile up more stones on top and leave it. And so that nobody can get to any of this stuff. It's all separated out. It's Achan and his whole family and everything he owns are dead and at the bottom of this pile of rocks. And then God gives them the battle plan for fighting against Ai. And he tells them to send not just 3,000, but to take the whole army and to take 33,000 of their army and go around behind the city at night, and then to send the rest of the army, the 3,000, to go and attack the front gates, or to take another group and go and attack the front gates, just as they had before. And then once the battle starts, for that 3,000 at the front gates to start retreating like they're being beaten just like before, and the people of Ai will think, well, here we go again, we're beating them, we're defeating them again, and they'll come out and chase you. And when the fighting men of Ai come out and chase the retreating army, the 33,000 that have gone around behind will come around and go in the open gates. And they follow the battle plan, and it works just like God said. They go and attack. The ones that are attacking, obviously, retreat away. The ones that have snuck around behind the city the night before come in behind them after the gates are open. They sack the city, kill whatever remaining fighting men are inside the city, and then that army that has been attacking the city then chases down the ones that are chasing the retreating Israelites, and then they catch them between them and crush the army of Ai between them. And so they win the battle, and just like with Jericho, God gives the command that the people of the city are to be destroyed, and the city itself is to be burned, but God tells them that they can take anything from the city that they want. They can take the gold and the silver, they can keep the animals and add it to their flocks, and so they can take stuff from this city, but they couldn't take it from Jericho. And so the people do, and they win against Ai. We'll pick up from there next time with the next story, which is the Gibeonites, what happens with them, and then we'll finish up Joshua and maybe be able to start Judges.